Go.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 5th event of our online roundtable series, Modern Greek Studies and Beyond, Local Cases, Global Debates. And this is a series in which we delve into timely theoretical, political, cultural debates with a global relevance by zooming in on local case studies, particularly from Greek culture. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 5th event of our online roundtable series, Modern Greek Studies and Beyond, Local Cases, Global Debates. And this is a series in which we delve into timely theoretical, political, cultural debates with a global relevance by zooming in on local case studies, particularly from Greek culture. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 5th event of our online roundtable. I'm sorry about this technical issue. So we'll continue. This series, this roundtable series, is organized in the framework of our cultural analysis network, Rethinking Modern Greek Studies in the 21st Century, which was founded and is being coordinated by Dimitris Papanikolaou, Christina Getgaudaite, and myself. And those of you who have followed our network's previous roundtable events may know that all these events are also available to watch through our YouTube channel. And we will be sharing the links to those events on YouTube so that you can check them out if you want. Our network also has a blog on our Torch webpage, to which 4 texts have just been added very recently. 2 of them by former participants in the roundtables, Maricia Frangu and Daniel Knight, and 1 by Christina Getgaudaite, and also an interview of Aretia Thamopoulou by Eva Fotiadi, who is a key player in today's roundtable. And this interview is directly linked to the topic of the roundtable today, so you can check them out if you want. If you want to stay informed about our network's activities and events, you can also now sign up for our newsletter through a link that we will be sharing on YouTube and through the chat in Zoom as well. We are also preparing a brand new website for the network under the name Modern Greek Studies Now, which has been made possible through thanks to a grant by the MGSA, the Modern Greek Studies Association. And we will be launching this website soon. So those of you who will sign up for our newsletter, we will hear about that as well. We hope to announce our next table event soon, and it will involve a discussion on race and also on Greece and the South. But I also want to alert you today already to another event that is also closely connected to our network, since some network members, including Dimitris Papanikolaou, are involved in this event as well as participants and speakers, and I am also involved as a co-organizer. This workshop is called From Crisis to Critique, Languages of Resistance, Transformation and Futurity in Mediterranean Crisiscapes. And we have keynote lectures by Nicolas de Genova and Nilgun Bayraktar, a roundtable discussion, and more. So we will also be sharing the registration link for those who might be interested. Now, before getting to today's event, I also want to thank Torch for their always invaluable support in the organization of these events, and Ambara Khalidi specifically, as well as the sponsors of our network's various activities, Torch from Oxford, of course, the Subfaculty of Modern Greek at Oxford, and the Ekaterini Laskaridis Foundation, who is also main sponsor of the Marilena Laskaridis Chair in Amsterdam. Now, today's roundtable event will retrace art and its histories in contemporary Greece and their role in the cultural and social study of the Greek world, but also in a globalized context today. The event is convened and moderated by 2 very dear colleagues, both based in the Netherlands, And we are very grateful to both of them for having put together a panel with such an amazing group of speakers. So these colleagues are Eva Fotiadi, who is a lecturer at St. Joost School of Art and Design in Den Bosch and Breda, and specializes in contemporary arts and design history and theory. And Anthea Giriou, who is a PhD candidate at the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis of the University of Amsterdam. And Anthea is working on a doctoral project with the title Mediterranean Drifts, Mobility and Migration in Speculative Fiction-Based Contemporary Art. And her project also involves artistic projects from Greece. So I will now give the word to Eva and Anthea, and we are very much looking forward to their presentations, to the presentations and the discussion that will follow.
Thank you very much, Maria. And of course, thank you very much also Dimitris and Christina and Ambara, and welcome everyone to this roundtable, which is going to be about art. We would like, Anthea and myself, we would like to start with a short introduction, and afterwards we are going to welcome also our speakers. So let me actually share my screen as I start. Yes. So on the photograph that we have shared with the announcement of this roundtable, you see a work titled Is Doxan. It would translate in English to the glory of. It is by Vlas Kaniaris, a Greek artist. It is a work from 1993 made of bags of cement powder of the known in Greece brand Titan. The bags form a large monumental cube wrapped up with in Greek flags. In 1993, the work commented on a Greece of frivolous living and spending, vanity and carelessness, expressed, among else, in construction projects, public and private, legal and illegal. In 2011, the same work was placed on the initiative of the Athens-based National Museum of Contemporary Art, which is mostly known by its abbreviation EMST, on Omonia Square at the center of Athens, which is what you see actually on the photo, right across the entrance to Athena Street, which leads from Omonia Square to the Acropolis Rock. And so you would actually be able to see the work of Kaniaris in front of you and then have a wonderful view to the Acropolis. 2011 was 7 years after the 2004 Olympic Games, a historic high point of excessive spending of financial capital and human efforts. Athens, the city of Athens, was the heart of a state tied up with debts and creditors. Development, including construction works, was at a standstill. Much of the old and the new infrastructure at the time was sliding into decay. Commercial and residential spaces were out of use, Olympic works abandoned. There wasn't money for anything, was the idea. One could ask, when was the monumental work by Kaniaris a more ironic comment, in 1993 or in 2011? During the work's presence on Omonia Square, the cement bags were repeatedly stolen and replaced. Eventually, the museum, EMST, moved the work to a less prominent location. One could ask, which use of the art was more timely in 2011, the symbolic or the practical one? In 2011, the then director of EMST, Anna Kafetsi, who had been the founding director back in 2000, is reported to have stated that it was a shame that the political, introverted and critical work of Kaniaris, which stood so open to various interpretations, is neither protected nor understood by its viewers. And that is my translation of the words of Anna Kafetsis. In 2020, the Greek Minister of Culture and Sport, Lina Mendoni, stated at the Greek Parliament with regard to EMST, and much to the astonishment of many people, I quote here, translation mine, the Greek taxpayer used to pay for a non-existing museum. The museum started existing in February 2020. And that was a time when the Minister Mendoni had inaugurated the new building of the Museum of Contemporary Art. One could ask, which of the failures derived from the words of the two leading figures in the Greek cultural sector, And I'm talking here about educational failures, cultural, political, administrative, institutional, or whatever other kinds of failures, annoy or sadden us the most. Contemporary artworks produce ways of thinking and methodologies of approaching the world. The production, circulation, and reception practices of art and its stories go part and parcel with situated social and political ways of making, experiencing, and inhabiting our historical moment. It is therefore not surprising that in recent years, contemporary art and its events, and here you might, for example, remember Documenta 14, which I assume many of you are acquainted with in 2017 in Athens. So contemporary art and its events are taken as tools by scholars and scientists across disciplines who try to think through and intervene in local and global discourses and situations. Not least those discourses and situations connected, for example, to Greece. With this in mind, we have invited scholars from various disciplines and addressed them with questions such as how do processes of globalization applied through the historical and geopolitical specifics of Greece affect the production, display, and theorization of art and its histories? In reverse, how can we use art's products and histories to talk about Greece in the present and the recent past? What kind of histories are at play when looking at art nowadays? What gaps from the past are we left with? And how do artistic practices walk through them? What are the roles of cultural and educational institutions in this context? And finally, in what ways do fields such as anthropology, cultural analysis, or economy intersect with contemporary art and art theory? So we are very much honored to have brilliant speakers today who have accepted our invitation to participate to tonight's roundtable. And now I would like to hand over the floor to Anthi, who is going to welcome and introduce our speakers. Thank you. And let me stop sharing my screen, actually.
So good afternoon from me too. Thank you all for being here. I would like to start first of all from a huge thanks to Dimitris Papanikolaou, Maria Bolecci and Christina Gerkautaiti, the backbone of Rethinking Modern Greek Studies network, for making this event possible in the first place. And of course, many, many thanks to Anne Barachalidi from Torch for her technical support and for her patience with us. As Eva said, we are joined today by a panel of excellent speakers, Angela Dimitrakaki, Milli Redmond, Karl Mousy, and Elpida Karaba are all going to reflect, among else, on the set of issues that Eva has just outlined. Unfortunately, our fifth speaker, George Mantius, was not able to be here with us today due to health issues, but we wish him a speedy recovery, and we really look forward to welcoming him on board for a future occasion. So before turning to our first speaker, allow me to share some very brief practical notes. Each presentation is going to be 10 minutes long, and once all presentations are completed, we're going to have a discussion addressing as well your questions and comments. So that said, we encourage those of you who are watching us on Zoom to submit your questions via the Q&A or the chat function, and those who are watching us on YouTube, you can just type your questions directly into the live stream chat. If possible, please type your questions during the talks rather than afterwards. This way we will hopefully be able to take to the speakers as many questions as possible. So I would like now to welcome our first speaker, Angela Dimitrakaki. Thank you very much for joining us. Angela Dimitrakaki is a senior lecturer in contemporary art history and theory at Edinburgh University, where she also directs the Master of Science, Modern and Contemporary Art. She has authored articles, essays, and books on subjects such as globalization, labor, gender, social reproduction, democracy, anti-fascism, and the art institution. Her latest book in English is Economy, Art, Production, and the Subject in the 21st Century. Her latest book chapter is Masculinity, Art and Value Extraction, an intersectional reading in the advance of capital as post-democracy, in Hilary Robinson and Maria Bazek editors, a companion to feminist art. Her latest article is on feminist art histories and class, forthcoming from the Oxford Art Journal in 2021. Angela Dimitrakaki co-edited the special issue on anti-fascism art theory for Third Text in 2019 and social reproduction and art for the same journal in 2017. She is corresponding editor of Historical Materialism and a co-organizer of the Marxist Feminist Stream for the journal's annual London conference. She is currently working on a project titled Feminism, Art, Capitalism. Angela Dimitrakaki is also an award-winning fiction writer in her native Greek, and she lives in Edinburgh and Athens. So the title of her presentation today is going to be Art History and Biopolitics, if not now, when? Thank you very much again, Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's here tonight, and of course for the invitation. My presentation is going to be a little bit raw in not a stream of consciousness, but something close to that. I gave it a title some time ago upon the invitation, which is Art History and Biopolitics, if not now, when? And perhaps it's going to be under 10 minutes. So the greatest challenge for art history in Greece is how to free itself from the grip of the bourgeoisie. Call them the ruling elite if you like, but let's not make the mistake of thinking they don't exist because they don't happen to have the pedigree of the elites of traditional imperialist nations. In other words, do not think that because Greece is seen and perhaps has a self-image of, is seen as a periphery or semi-periphery, that it doesn't have a capitalist class and that this class does not exercise an ideological hegemony, but also a material domination on the country's art field. Indeed, I would suggest that if anything, this status, this self-perception of Greece as semi-periphery or periphery has facilitated a more secure hegemony of this class in the field. On the one hand, the long-term absence of state-supported infrastructure, an absence that was in place long before the emergence of neoliberalism in certain countries and globally, or even austerity economics, signal to anyone who might want to become an artist that he or she would need to carry the stamp of class privilege. The outsourcing of contemporary art infrastructure to the philanthropic branch of big capital as collectors or private foundations witnessed in recent years is simply symptomatic of this trend. This is so entrenched that it is still only met with minor opposition, even from the more militant quarters of the Greek art world. And it remains, to me at least, quite unforgettable that so many voices rose just a few years back against Documenta 14. We saw graffiti against it as a colonial enterprise almost on Athens walls. Sorry, just like. But we haven't had, it remains, yes, that you'd be hard-pressed to find any such vocal and concentrated opposition to the country's private capital. So we have peculiar kinds of nationalism perhaps operating here. And to this day, this distinction between foreign and local capital has not been the subject of public debate to the extent that it should have, at least. In fact, art and the economy appear to be the elephant in the room that very few are willing to address, it seems to me. It's not that artists have not been demanding a state-funded infrastructure over the years. They sure have. and the recent and current struggles of art workers following the devastating, obviously, impact of the state's management of the pandemic constitutes a new wave of consciousness-raising efforts in that regard. What I'm pointing at, however, is the reluctance or perhaps ideological inability, which is a term I'd like to discuss later, to question the outsourcing of contemporary art infrastructure to big money. Greek artists have held the state, meaning the public sector, responsible for the continuous marginalization of contemporary art, but have not at the same time addressed in a systematic way the role of capital as art patron in this state of affairs. In recent years, the rise of so-called commoning practices in the international, perhaps even the global art field, including in Greece, was added as an important factor in the further exemption of capital from being targeted or at least scrutinized. As everywhere, this turn, enabled through the notable rise of socially engaged art, took place against a social horizon from which the revolutionary prospect was absent. That is, it occurred in the context of secure capitalist relations of production and reproduction, which is important for understanding what happened. What happened was the situation generated the both famous and infamous triangle of state, capital, the commons, with the commons extending to infrastructure, the also infamous myth of fascistic autonomy inherited through the very complex trajectory of the avant-gardes and modernism overall. The relationships among the agents of this tripolar schema have never been critically addressed. Rather, we have witnessed the operation of a functional myth, according to which all three agents somehow contribute to sustaining the contemporary arts in the country. The myth has served to generate the illusion of autonomy for part of the infrastructure, the commons, which rests on the far more embedded myth of the artist or the curator, for that matter, that they can achieve various things on a practically non-existent budget. The amount of voluntary labor, free labor, if you want, you can call it labor of love, required to sustain the illusion of the infrastructure triangle is phenomenal. The fatigue that one agent of the triangle, the commons, the commoning practices, has or have been experiencing is also phenomenal. And it would have long evaporated had it not been for the constant flow of, what we call new blood that remains unattracted to the prospect of becoming an accountant or just an accountant and seeks to enter the creativity flow. But my question is precisely how the triangle, with all its problems, becomes an ideological and material platform for managing. This is a managerial function for managing one of the most highly educated and potentially critical groups of the population in Greece that I will refer to as art workers. In other words, I'm interested in the function of the infrastructure triangle as a biopolitical mechanism, okay? So this is what I mean by management, the impact of which is diffused in the social body. That this happens in a period when biopolitics has entered colloquial speech makes my interest perhaps less idiosyncratic. It was in 2002 when Boris Groys, quite well-known art theorist, wrote about art in the age of biopolitics. This is the phrase he used in his essay for the catalogue of Documenta 11. My only contribution to art theory, published in Greek as a book, was subtitled From the Postmodern Sign to the Biopolitical Arena, and came out in 2013. The study did not focus on the Greek art scene, and this was a conscious decision I made. I did not have the data to examine the triangle, which means that I did not have the data to narrate the relationships among the three agents I have pointed to here. Although I knew that as I was writing between 2008 and 2013, the third agent, commoning practices, was necessarily gaining momentum. And I hope that I hardly need to remind us what these 5 years were about. In summary, the acceleration of austerity capitalism of the global financial crisis period necessarily brought forth what Massimo De Angelis has called the commons fix. It's a very memorable and strong phrase. And its chapter on this actually is, we did include it in the book called Economy that was mentioned before. So the commons fix is the reliance of capital, in many ways, the dependency of capital on autonomous structures for reproducing itself, meaning for furthering its cycle of accumulation and for generating the illusion that a level of change is possible without a revolutionary prospect. Today, in 2021, and in the first global crisis of this century, where I would say social reproduction is primarily what is at stake, Operation Biopolitics as managing a multi-entry, a kind of multifocal disaster is entering a new stage. I'm not at all certain as to how the social knowledge of the period 2008 to 2013 will turn into a resource for performing the necessary and necessarily rebellious critique of the art field in Greece. And with this, we come to the responsibility of art history, or I will say Greek art history, in enabling such knowledge, both at the level of knowledge production, but also obviously dissemination. So Greek art history has been hostage to the hegemony of the capitalist class far more than other parts of the art field. Anyone who studied art history in Greece, as I did at the end of the Cold War, let's say around 1990, knows this. It took years and much free labor on the part of our historians operating in the margins of higher education, always in the margins of higher education, for only partly containing the onslaught and irrelevance of formalism, which dominated, at least up to a certain point, and this is just to begin with. So efforts to launch a Greek social history of art, and especially social history of art addressing the contemporary, even now, I would say possibly the post-contemporary is a term that is discussed at the moment, and shaping a critical imaginary for the future have met and are meeting with obstacles that would make up a long list. But now, right now, in 2021, to be blunt, the shit has hit the fan, as we say. In the major restructuring of the art field that is underway, and it's underway internationally, perhaps even globally, a Greek art history that would articulate the connection between art and biopolitics is, to my mind, the only way forward. This proposed art history would need to return to the etymology of the word history as a critical narrative for causes and relations that, as an inquiry, in fact, that has no special commitment to the past, which is really the art history I was exposed to. There's always the past, you know, or what I would call the vertical axis. It needs to be a rhizomatic art history that would jettison its connection with archaeology. I don't mean the discipline specifically, but the mindset, and replace it with a horizon of prefigurative politics. For this to happen, art history perhaps should take seriously the question of emancipatory epistemologies, and it must do so in what I would call a reclaimed national context. And this is something I'm not saying lightly, as my antipathy towards anything national is part of my identity. It's totally sustained. I think, however, that the tradition of selective importation of the latest intellectual trend is not necessarily a sign of the connectedness of the arts scene in Greece. I don't even want to call it the Greek arts, and it entails a different meaning, this designation, with, let's say, global developments. That is, if Greek art history is to attend to the changes that are going on, perhaps to the material divides that that proliferate, that may themselves be addressed or not, and then why not, by artworks generated out of the particular impasses of a border/fortress country, which is what Greece has become. I feel it needs to really articulate this, to entrench actually the idea of emancipatory epistemologies in relation to biopolitics as a management operation. In short, I'm arguing for an art history in terms of not a dialogue, but a dialectic with the dead ends of present-day global capitalism. And I hope we will have the chance to discuss this further at this roundtable. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela, for this insightful talk, which I think sets the grounds by connecting art not only to biopolitics, but also economy. And it's really interesting that it can also work as a bridge to the very timely topic of biopolitics, which is exactly what the previous roundtable of this webinar series was focused on. And that roundtable was titled Our Intense Biopolitical Present, COVID and Before. But now we do have a take that takes into account especially the art field. And perhaps there's going to be more to discuss on that. So from this quite thought-provoking analysis, we will move with our next speaker to a very distinctive recent moment, which I think really marked this entanglement of contemporary art discourse and the Greek context. That was, of course, Documenta 14, and Angela Dimitrakaki has already brought this up. So I would like to welcome Milli Redmond. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Geneva, the Arabic department, and an independent art educator based in Kassel. Her research focus is the history and historiography of the international large-scale exhibition Documenta. Milli Redmond uses its database to trace encounters of artists labeled Arab with the exhibition series, shifting the center from which Documenta's history is being told. This focus allowed her to recast the exhibition series' troubling claim to universalism in terms of the nationalist sentiment expressed by its founders, many of whom she could link directly to previously held memberships of the Nazi Party. In 2017, Milli Redmond spent 4 months in Athens prior to and following the opening of the Athens leg of Documenta 14, where she was aiming to figure out what the working title of the exhibition, Learning from Athens, would mean for her work as an art educator for Documenta in Kassel. In Kassel, she worked intensively with the presentation of the Athens Ems Museum collection that was shown under the title Antidolon at the Museum Fredericianum. So the title of Mil's presentation tonight is Down the Rabbit Hole, Mediating the Ems collection at Documenta 14. Thank you very much for joining us, Mil. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Antti, and thank you, Eva, for your invitation. And I will jump right in. Wait a second, I have a slide for to begin with, so that you have an impression of one of the central spaces of Documenta 14 in Kassel, where I've been working in the neoclassicist building to the right. The other one, you know, it was the replica of the Parthenon. Good. Okay, I think we all know by now the Emst that I will be talking about a lot to this evening is the Ethnico-Museo Synchronis Technis, the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens. It was invited by Documenta 14 to exhibit its collection at Documenta's traditional main venue, the one I pointed to you, out to you on the right of my slide. In recounting some of my key experiences with mediating this exhibition, I will focus on what Documenta 14 and the Emst, in my opinion, got right about their self-positionings as institutions between global and local art worlds. One encounter particularly shapes my memory of working for Documenta 14. I had joined a guided tour by a colleague of mine and casually asked an older visitor from Kassel how she had liked the Emst collection. I was surprised by her answer because even though she owned a season pass, during the previous 3 months, she had never felt the need to actually go and see it. My husband, she told me, enjoyed humanist education. Thus, we already know everything that there is to know about Greece since more than 60 years. Well, the Emst collects everything that has been or has become important to Greek art worlds after this woman was actually finished leaving learning and excuse me. So after this woman was finished learning everything that there is to know about Greece, in her opinion. But in fact, well, I could have used her confidence dearly because, well, I have been lost in this exhibition at first and I wasn't alone in it. Actually, the preparation to mediate this exhibition was a guide's nightmare. We had nothing to work by except for the list of exhibits. And also after the opening, well, as a cultural scientist, to be honest, my impulse was to go and take a degree in modern Greek studies or to take a year-long internship with a museum first, because before I could even begin to speak about its collection. At some point, though, I realized that I wasn't actually unprepared for this experience. It was just that I was reluctant to put our training into action. And this is the point where I invite you, everybody who's here virtually, to, if you have a pen at hand, work with me on one of the exercises that we did in preparation for Documenta 14, so that to get an idea of what the basis was that we needed to work with. I will read to you the English translation of a fragment by the ancient Greek playwright Euripides. If you happen to have a pen at hand, well, then I'd like to ask you, as I said, to draw along with me. And if you don't, then don't bother. Just listen and I'll show you my interpretation. What you will hear is the description of the writing marking the side of a ship, which is given by an illiterate man. He says, "I'm not skilled at letters, but I will explain the shapes and clear symbols to you. first, there is a circle, marked out as if it were with a compass, and it has a clear sign in the middle. The second one is first of all 2 strokes and then another one, keeping them apart in the middle. The third is curly like a lock of hair, and the fourth is 1 line going straight up and then 3 crosswise ones attached to it. The fifth, well, it's not easy to describe. There are 2 strokes which run together from separate points to 1 support. And the last one is like the third. As you can see from my interpretation, I am illiterate too when it comes to the Greek language. Probably some of you got it right. This was an excerpt from Theseus. To me, this exercise felt extremely humbling. It confronted me with the limits of what I could expect from myself in the face of the task of mediating this mega exhibition. But the passage, however, fulfilled more purposes than just to make us feel stupid and overwhelmed. It prefaces actually a text commissioned by Documenta 14 on the uses of scores in contemporary art practices. And these uses go well beyond notation systems for classical music. For Documenta 14, scores could take on the shape of texts or drawings that detailed performances and social actions. Recast in these terms, also we just followed a score written down by Euripides more than 2,000 years ago. In preparation to our job as educators, we repeatedly had to design different kinds of scores for groups and exhibition spaces. And this experiential knowledge proved extremely helpful for mediating the Amst collection. And while learning to create an experience rather than to transmit knowledge was very uncomfortable at first, in hindsight, I'm actually very grateful for the time I spent with visitors in the exhibition completely clueless. What we did, well, silent walks. Nobody spoke. We moved in slow motion and tried to listen and see and absorb the artwork's materiality. We would observe how they were placed in space by the curators, how they interacted with each other or resonated with other parts of the exhibition, which includes for me both in Kassel and in Athens. We could exchange stories and feelings evoked by these experiences we had in the space of the exhibition, and we would also collectively Google for facts, because it's the year 2017. So we could try to look up artist biographies, details of ancient myths and modern historical events, and by this piece together curatorial narratives and the narratives of individual artworks, at least in parts. We found actually a lot of stories, and to us they told a multifaceted history of contemporary Greek art and of artists in a globalizing world. In a nutshell, I would say the exhibition stitched together the experiences of those who migrated and those who stayed during times of political and social upheaval. Chronologically, it ranged from the military junta in the 1960s and 1970s through to a call for solidarity amidst the contemporary financial and refugee crisis. Art historically, well, the exhibition addressed currents from, let's say, arte povera through action painting, pop art to immersive installations and post-internet art. And it managed actually to connect, or we managed to connect intellectual currents from historical materialism and physics through to metaphysics, psychoanalysis, feminism, to name but a few. By inviting the Ems to Kassel, I argue, the international team of Documenta 14 managed to successfully engage the largely local public in an experiment of unlearning. We as guides, together with our audiences, had to unlearn our entitlement to quick authoritative answers. Normally, they would be provided to us by institutions in the form of guidebooks or pre-written audio walks or texts produced around them. We had none of that. So what we got was the safe space of an exhibition in which we were able to confront the uncertainty and discomfort of giving up privileges. Together, we tried to unlearn the need to constantly be in control and instead to accept trusting our senses. The realization that collectivizing questions and experiences would be the only way forward, guiding us a little bit deeper into uncharted territory, was just as powerful to us, or to me at least, and many in my groups. So the collectivizing questions and experiences was a powerful experience, yes, just as the realization that others would be much better prepared than us to actually navigate this exhibition. Not being in the knowledgeable position opened up possibilities to issue easy answers and to really listen and engage with the exhibition itself. With this, the Emst exhibition was arguably the most powerful and eloquent example of Documenta 14's central theoretical stance in Kassel. But I am wondering what it does to the Emst collection if it is being recast in terms of this ability to teach us unlearning, us as audiences. Did the Emst collection become a function of Documenta in this way? Or could it retain its independence from this heavy framing? I don't have an answer for that. But I want to conclude on one point that is again centered on the visitor experience, which is that, the psychology of learning tells us that the discomfort of real puzzlement leads to real questions, leads to more profound and longer lasting learning experiences. And actually, since Documenta 14 closed, I have met a number of people who tell me of the academic, activist and artistic rabbit holes that both Documenta 14 and the Emst exhibition have sent them down, and which they're still busy exploring. In this way, centered on the visitor experience, this kind of impactful and long-lasting engagement with artistic and curatorial stances, which developed from and triggered by local practices that hold few claims to actual universal applicability. It's all that I, as an educator, but also as a researcher engaged with art in a global context, can wish for. I'm curious what you think about this, and I'm looking forward to our discussion, but for now, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mil, for this stimulating talk and for, okay, now you can also see me, great. And for this sharing of your experience of actually working in Kassel with Emst collection, shown in the context of Documenta. So before moving on to our next speaker, perhaps that could be the right moment to just let you know, the ones that joined us later on, that it is really easy to submit your questions if you're watching us on Zoom via the Q&A function or the chat function, and those who are watching us on YouTube, you can just type directly your questions or comments in the live stream chat. So our next speaker will draw attention to a different historical period, and he's going to bring together modern Greek studies and visual analysis of photographs. Very familiar to some of us, Karl Mousy. Thank you very much for joining us. Karl Mousy is a PhD candidate in modern Greek studies at King's College, London. His research focuses on the intersection of modern Greek identity formation with Greek photography in the first half of the 20th century. Previously, he worked at the National Museums of World Culture in Sweden. And I have to add here that Karl has been also a participant in rethinking modern Greek studies. I had the chance to see him presenting part of his research in our first conference in Oxford. So the title of Karl's talk today is going to be Thinking Through Photography in Modern Greece.
Well, thank you very much, Anthi, and thank you, Eva, for the invitation to participate in this very interesting roundtable we're having here today. I'd also like to thank Maria, Dimitris, and Christina, as well as Anbara from Torch for putting this series of events together and for sustaining a discussion throughout our individual pandemic isolations. What I hope to do in these next 10 minutes or so is to offer some thoughts on some ways in which photography is an important object of analysis, as well as an important prism through which to view modern Greek society and history. Phrased differently, how to use photography as a way to think through modern Greece, rather than using photographs as an illustration of modern Greece and its past. And these thoughts stem from my own research, which deals with photography's contribution to the formation of modern Greek identity, primarily in the first half of the 20th century, where I've been looking in particular at the interwar era through the photography of the well-known photographer Nellis, and at the immediate post-war World II era through the photography produced by the Marshall Plan. And therefore, I will offer somewhat of a more historical perspective, and also relating this to the particular perspective of modern Greek studies. And what I hope to elicit is the ambiguity surrounding photography as documentary evidence, art, and as a practice, issues that I think affect the ways in which photography is approached in the study of modern Greece. Now, like all good ideas, this idea of using photography to think through things is borrowed from somewhere else. And in this particular case, it is from Siegfried Krakauer's posthumously published book, The Last Things Before the Last, which is an exploration of history and historiography. And it's a topic that maybe most people would not associate with Krakauer's earlier work on photography and film theory. And within this book, he discusses the writing of history alongside photography as a way to help us think through things and not above them. So rather as a way of engaging with the transient nature of the outside world and sort of making the matters of the outside world more concrete. Now, in my turn, I encountered Krakauer's ideas or his idea in George Kouvados' book, The Old Greeks, Cinema, Photography, and Migration, which uses photography and cinema, which is Kouvados' field of expertise, as prisms to look at the experience of migration of Kouvados' own family from Cyprus to Australia. And I think Kouvados' book engages closely with the function of memory, particularly through visual media like photography. And I mentioned as a useful example of this approach of a closer engagement with photography, even though he does it in a very sort of particular personal manner. It's a very personal, thoughtful book, which I would recommend. So in what way can photography help us think through Greece and modern Greek history? For starters, I would like to propose a basic historical argument, placing the history of modern Greece alongside the history of photography. Now, both come into being during the 1830s and have since then been keenly intertwined. And Greece was an early adopter of photography, or I should rather say that photography adopted Greece early on as a specific topos. And the first photographers and photographs in Greece were, of course, foreign and seeking to capture ancient Greece rather than the newly minted Greek state and newly formed modern Greek society. And perhaps the early photographic technology might have helped them cement an image of Greece as a land of classical ruins. The long exposure times might have meant that the timeless structures of the past were captured while the restless human figures of the present left no imprint, leaving us with these sometimes eerie timeless landscapes that are sort of only populated by very few people. And on the whole, I think that photography reflects the stories or the histories that Greek society wished to tell itself. And this is also reflected through the history of Greek photography, from the early ruin romanticism to the sun-drenched postcard aesthetic of the post-war Greek photographic society. Echoing Eva's published discussion with the Greek art historian Aretia Damopoulou, I would like to turn to this gap between visual studies and modern Greek studies. Modern Greek studies has traditionally had a focus on literature, language, and history, which is also reflected in the study of Greek identity. And although this debate over identity might indeed be an old debate, I believe that using photography to think through it yields fruitful results in shifting our focus, if you will. And I do believe you see this interest in using photography in this approach that I'm discussing, both within and outside of Greece. And I think in the English-speaking world, the recent edited volume Camera Greca, which came out of a conference on Greek photography at King's College London, is an interesting example of this. And similarly, as the art history Greece is primarily taking place inside of Greece, this is also mostly true for the study of its photography. But we find ourselves also in a curious situation where the history of Greek photography is still being written. And I'm curious myself as to the effects of this ongoing history writing process, if you will, in expanding our relationship to photography in Greece. Now, regardless, within modern Greek studies, I do think we see to some extent, a disconnect between treating photography seriously as something beyond documentation or as belonging solely to an art history, therefore maybe outside the realm of modern Greek studies writ large. And in our approaches to photography, I think interdisciplinarity is key, since photography does not really belong to anyone. Photographs are ambiguous and alienating. Photography is both a trace of the outside world, but also a representation of it, which does complicate our relationship to it. And they are therefore intimately connected to the outside world, but they are also therefore troublesome objects that unsettle our relationship to the past and the world around us. I would like to offer an example of this thinking through photography taking place through other disciplines like anthropology, and specifically in the case of Greece. And this is a recent book by Konstantinos Kalatzis, Tradition in the Frame, which through photographic practices and sort of ways of visualizing Crete and tradition, especially in the highlands around Sfakia, is a very interesting local example, but then also, of course, has a greater engagement also with more national examples, but also more global frameworks. Now, the visual and historical anthropologist Elizabeth Edwards summarizes quite well what I'm trying to get at, that we should not focus on the image alone, and that photographs are parts of complex social processes that should be taken into account. And I think this approach is equally fruitful for art historical approaches, which is already, I would say, quite common, and maybe the non-art historical approaches. And here I'm alluding to modern Greek studies writ large again. Edwards also makes an argument that photographs are perhaps too raw for academic history. And in this sense, he's channeling what the French art historian Georges Didier Huberman has discussed, is that we expect too much and also too little from photographs. So if we try to ask the whole truth from photographs, we will be disappointed, for they are inexact. They're not really up to the task. Or if we ask too little, we end up maybe relegating them to the sphere of the simulacrum. And I think this really highlights the ambiguity of photography, which I find so particularly interesting. So in this sense, photography opens up more questions than it can answer. And it is more or less mute and deaf. And coming back to George Kouvaros, he phrases in a succinct way that photographs cannot answer our questions, so we must answer them ourselves or just scream into the void. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carl, for this brilliant talk. I think it's really interesting that you have already addressed these the contours of different fields of study, such as modern Greek studies and like more art-related studies in relation to the study of photography, and also your engagement with this archive of photographs from the Marshall Plan works, I think ties up really well with our next speaker as well, because we're now going to extend this sort of critical engagement with archives, albeit in quite different terms. So I would like to welcome Elpida Karaba. Thank you for joining. Elpida Karaba is an art theorist and independent curator. Her work and publishing record is focusing on the relationship between art and system of knowledge, archival art and art in the public domain, history and theory of art, feminism and performative research-based and activist artistic practices. Elpida Karaba is working at the crossroad of contemporary art, critical theory and emergent political manifestations in the public realm. She's a visiting lecturer at the School of Fine Arts, Athens. She's also head of research at the Center of New Media and Feminist Public Practices at the Department of Architecture, University of Thessaly. And in 2014, she initiated, the Temporary Academy of Arts, known by its abbreviation in Greek as PAT, which is a para-institution, a hybrid of artistic, curatorial and educational practice. Part of PAT is the Society of Cultural Workers, dedicated to the study, analysis, promotion and support of working affairs in culture. The title of her talk today is Wasted Art Histories, Spectralizing a Space of Appearance. Thank you again, Elpida. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Eva and Thi, and all the team for inviting me to this exciting roundtable discussion. Okay, I will share now with you my thoughts on wasted art histories. For my presentation of Wasted Project of Temporary Academy of Arts, I have gathered different parts of our work and, sorry, I have to stop for 1 minute, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, this is what happens when we all work from home.
Exactly, yeah. I was about to comment.
Sorry, technical problems.
You're already back, great.
Yes, I'm already back. So for my presentation of Wasted Project of Temporary Academy of Arts, I have gathered different parts of our work and made a pastiche, which I'm afraid sounds a little bit as a manifesto. In this one can hear our kings, the voices of Federici, De Loretis, Fanon, Membes, Haraways, Athanasius, Dimitrakakis, Work, Lodis, and other king voices, which are our companions. As I was thinking how to start today, I thought of the vast initiative back in the 90s of East Art Map, an archive of art of the former Eastern Bloc, aiming to claim its own history in order to negotiate the terms of its entrance and capitalization to the Western art world. Their motto, history is not a given, please helps us to construct it, bears something of the optimism of the 90s. An optimism which has been connected to the fabrication of the art scenes in cosmopolitanism, with which Greece entered the new millennium, along with the much-awaited Olympics of 2004, fantasizing the inclusion in the international art scene. Though this was not really a cosmopolitan scene, but the arena of the accelerated globalized economical and biotechnological condition, which has taken the name of multiple crises. Thus, the optimism of the idea of local art scenes within the global imperative became wasted. Greece, and especially the city of Athens, has been identified with an exotic view of a southern experiment of creative sustainability in times of crisis. A new South was reinvented based on power relations and stereotypes which are repeated that relocalize and re-regionalize the world and the subjects. In these narratives, Athens is spending on its bipolar identity between economic catastrophe, refugee asphyxiation, and exemplary creative energy. Thus, facing our location, positioning, and situating within the global and its institutions, in 2014, we initiated the Temporary Academy of Arts. As its name reveals, the precarization and flexibilization embodied within the education and creative industry was our derive. PAT is a para-institution, meaning that it is part of the cultural machinery and it doesn't proscribe institutions altogether, but attempts to participate in the construction of new institutions, part of which is history itself. PAT is a tool that aims to shake up the special parameters that describe the local convention, the conditions of work, education, knowledge, and the production of discourse. The lack of public institutional investment in contemporary artistic production versus the obsession with archaeology that prevails in our country, and the association of these things with phenomena of chauvinism, sectionalism, and historical nationalism. The disengagement of artistic production from the economy and working conditions in the field of art are some of local conventions with which we are confronted. PAT works collectively and looks for synergies, and up to now has produced studies, texts, works of art, as tools of enforcement, as tools to demythologize what is irrelevant to us. A commitment to demythologizing has nothing to do with the local, national, xenophobic decentralization. It has to do with seeing ourselves clearly, not as an act of succession from the rest of the world, but in relation to ourselves and to other selves with whom we share the world. At the moment, we are working on a new tool. Wasted is our area of development and research. I'm just sharing here the archive site that we're working at the moment. On Wasted. Wasted is a call to define new aspects of wasted subjects and matter, from the precarious art workers' bodies to the new wasted subject produced by the pandemic. Wasted Research has produced a small publication working as a script for Wasted Lives, a series of performative events where people from different fields are invited to improvise on the idea of wasted, a procedure which will lead to the development of a waste lexicon to re-articulate humanitarian, ecological, biotechnological, economical, you name it, issues, revealing how these are constructed globally by capital. Wasted is a web organism, a durational artwork of situated knowledge. We address our invitation to different collaborators in order to create a wasted vision of his, her stories, mythologies, methodologies, art, voices, writings, and keys. Wasted stands as an empty signifier, and we would like our collaborators to contribute in shaping it and construct it to be our nodal point of articulation. We gather material referring to moments of recent Greek history, as, for example, the liberalization of the local production and health system, the cleansing operations of the neoliberal state, the dismantling of an art militant group. These are small moments in the global history, but interconnected to the big image of the globalized economical and biotechnological condition. In the wasted material gathered also appear descriptions of works of art produced by Greek artists, connected to moments of recent Greek history in diverse ways. Again, these are small moments of the global art history, but they are though interconnected to practices of interest. We want these moments of Greek history and Greek art history to be known, not enmeshed in a circuit of capital flow, but to be integral parts of a radical nexus of art, theory, and education. Thus, the work of the artist Natasha Biza tells the strange story of a collection of luxury items that arrived in Athens in 1949 during the post-World War II period and within the Civil War as part of the Marshall Plan Aid, and the work of Agelis Vlachos investigates the paths of diverse and reverse cartographies, the turnovers of geopolitical gains, as for examples were expressed in the relations of Greece to Middle East in the 80s. These works, among other things, refer to the politics of side looks. Wasted is our side look and our out-of-source investment. And we ask ourselves, what is our own geography of the South, the one we understand and the one we identify with, the one we want to belong to or the one we belong to without realizing it? Ours is an attempt to match political moments with cultural and countercultural crossroads. One cannot be naive when mapping up one's own or collective roots, straight, diverse, or perverse. All the above have limits, the same way that our thoughts of an anti-waste front have limits. But if it is not too late for reform, let us consider updating our tools and sharpening our thinking, working against the power configurations that determine whose stories count. What we would like to bring forth is that wasted itself can undertake an important conceptual and political reconfiguration when at stake are dissident tasks of defending and politicizing wasted subjects and matters. This is a kind of theorizing that would take us beyond the abstract and universal generality of wasted and would have us challenge the overriding power differentials that determine the structural experience of being wasted. Perhaps this tactic prefigure and spectralize, as Athanasiou says, a space of appearance, unexpectedly turning it into a site of collective potentiality for alternative imagining and enacting stories and art stories. As feminists have taught us, what counts is the ongoing effort to create new spaces of discourse, to rewrite cultural narratives, and to define the terms of another perspective, a view from elsewhere. In the words of De Lauretis, this elsewhere is not some mythic distant past or some utopian future history. It is the elsewhere of discourse here and now. The wasted material we gather is an archive bearing, as Derrida has taught us, the commencement, the power, and the peace. An archive was realized, in Angela's phrasing, on the encounter and enmeshment of desires, motives, and aspirations that can at first be temporary, as the Temporary Academy of Arts is, unstable or shared by a very small number of people, but to be eventually enacted to a novel aesthetic form and technique. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elpida, for this illuminating presentation, which kind of offered also a closer look at the activities, some of the activities of Temporary Academy of Arts. And I think it's really important that there is a concrete example of an initiative that really engages with understudied or sidelined aspects of art and art history, at least in the Greek context. So I think that you have all brought up different aspects in these dialectics between not only art and history, but also social and political concerns, starting from the example of Greece, so right here and right now, but also opening up a wider frame of time and space. There is a lot to discuss further. So while there are still questions coming in from the audience, perhaps I could start with addressing a more general question to all speakers. You kind of touched upon this like part of this question already, some of you at least. And let me explain why I'm asking that. So part of Eva's and mine motivation for putting this discussion together was also to kind of delineate or probe the limits of art history and art theory as discourses and disciplines themselves, and to find out what kind of exchanges and what kind of collaborations with other fields of study are taking place, if they are taking place. So I'll take it that they are taking place. Given that some of you are art historians or art theorists, in particular Elpida and Angela, but for instance, Carl and Mil, you come from different backgrounds, you are affiliated to different sort of departments like modern Greek studies and Arab studies departments. I was wondering if you would like to reflect on your experiences of actually positioning your own work and research in relation to other fields of study. So for Elpida and Angela, positioning yourselves in interdisciplinary contexts, and for Carl and Mil, for positioning themselves in their research in more strictly art-related contexts. So how does this work? What kind of challenges have you faced, and what kind of ways have you come up with to work through this? I'm thinking that these experiences might come from like being in your own department, or by participating in conferences, workshops, and any sort of joint projects. So is there anyone who would like to start with that?
I don't know if it's relevant in a response to the comment or question with which you opened, but whatever is happening in modern Greek studies, it doesn't kind of, it doesn't cross over to departments of history of art, for instance. And that is something that needs to be addressed at some point. I don't know at which point. I don't know the extent to which this should be a part of this discussion. But for instance, writing an art theory book in Greek had a cost for me. I mean, it's something that I can't submit formally as work where I am. And if I was working on literature, you know, rather than writing it, it'd be different. But art history, and to the extent that we are addressing the visual arts, I mean, if this is the right term, have been left out of modern Greek studies. So that's my very brief kind of open response to this. I don't know how this could be taken forward or the historical reasons why it has shaped like this, the situation, let's call
it. To add to that, I mean, it's kind of related to the to what Angela said in her text, that it is very rare that in history of art endeavors there are radical epistemologies involved. So basically, it's very much kind of fixed within a certain ideological frame of how we are writing art history. I think this is part of the problem.
Yeah, I recognize very much what both Angela and Elpida are referring to, that there is not this crossover between art history and modern Greek studies. And relating this to the question, how do I position the research in these related contexts? Like, well, out of necessity, in some ways, because you have to sort of try to make this space for yourself. I find it challenging, and having presented my work in modern Greek studies context, I'm often one of the only people that is presenting either on visual material or on specifically photographic material. And I noticed that there is a great interest in it, but there isn't a way to discuss it. I find so there's this crossover is not there, and I think that is of course lacking. And I think there could be very fruitful. Very fruitful research that comes out of such a collaboration.
Of course, my initial question did not concern modern Greek studies alone, right? So I was actually asking about more interdisciplinary exchanges with different areas of study. But in your case, I do get the point, of course. Yeah, sure.
If I can add something to this, I think that having mentioned practice of commoning in my paper, in my short paper, there's a lot of work and theoretical work, right? Not just in the context of our practice, that takes place within independent formations. I would say that Elpida's work with Pat is one such example. And there are other examples, and there have been many examples, but when these things are left in the margins, perhaps they should be there to be able to produce something which is actually exterior to the very suffocating, as I have experienced it, context that certain disciplines in Greece continue having. So there is this issue of like whether certain things should be happening and being kind of like articulated from a marginal position for the reason that they are there actually to bring this a kind of semi-outside, if I can call it that, which is necessary in every context, and which naturally arises in some ways. But the issue is, on the one hand, there is the kind of relatively strict framework of the Greek university, which, well, at least I have found it, quite strict in my encounters with it. That changes very slowly, things are not accommodated, and so on. And on the other hand, there is the far more extrovert art scene, right, which necessarily functions in an international setting, irrespective of whether something happens just in Greece or even Athens and so on, right, and Thessaloniki, etc. So there are many contradictions there, but I think my concern is the expenditure of labor, and this project that Elpida talked about, wasted, this feeling of being completely consumed in terms of your labor power, if I can use a Marxist term, right? That you're completely consumed, that sooner or later you have to face the wall of reality, which is that you need funding in order to continue, and where will this come from, and how are you going to keep your identity in the margins for doing whatever it is you're doing. So it's a loop that is very hard to break. It's not, of course, exclusive to Greece, far from it, but it does have certain particular parameters, I think, in Greece.
Sorry, I don't want this to be a ping pong, but the thing is that margin is one thing, but I'm very much insisting on the instituting praxis, because it's not only to just like prescribe the institution, it's how we can reinstituting, how we can find tools to reinstituting the institutions, and how practices that they can have the luxury of the margins, not to be marginalized, but to be able somehow to form, to be part of forming new ways of doing our institutions, enacting our institutions. And I think this is related to what Areti Adamopoulou, dear friend, is asking about which subjects of Greek art history would we consider as important or interesting to an international audience. I would say all subjects. The thing is how you present those in the international audience. What are the epistemologies you activate? What are the positionality that you are taking to offer this situated knowledge? Because all subjects are relevant, I would say. Okay.
Yeah. I would like actually to pick the last points of Elpida and the previous ones, and also the point of what would make interesting themes. Indeed, sometimes when it comes actually to bridging art history with other disciplines, then there is this, it seems in recent years, that if you might want to find an audience, in relating art and art history to a global, within the context of art history to a broader audience, then you have to talk about the global south, for instance. And you might want to do it, but it's actually very limited the context within you might be able to link, it seems. But I would go back to Elpida's point that it is whether you actually touch this a theme or whether you touch this a way. And having said that, actually, I would like to, we have already a few kind of more questions from the audience, but I would like to pose again an open question to everyone. And feel free to respond as you find relevant. While preparing this discussion for today, I was having a look at the news of today, and there was actually very central for a piece of news in Greece that has to do with that, which doesn't really happen, that the following, there was a piece of news about censorship. So there is this law which relates to the anti-terrorist law, and it included certain ways of formulating the draft of the law, which could include actually artworks. So if anyone would like to comment on this, feel free. But, so from the ones who might already be informed, but I would actually like to take this point and relate it also to the practice of everyone and to art history. How would you potentially find, do you see ways in which censorship and sometimes self-censorship relates to how history and art has been talked about and art history has been written about in the context of Greece? For instance, if I think of Angela's talk, ways in which people might have self-censored themselves because you always talk to the bourgeoisie, for instance, or when it comes to Carl's talk about photography, ways in which certain archives have not been touched or they have not been made accessible, and whether this relates to forms of censorship and also self-censorship related to how people actually perform themselves as art historians. And of course, when it comes to wasted, you can relate to that. And when it comes to to the Documenta, how potentially the educators of Documenta 14 sometimes self-censored themselves when it came to what to say and what not to say. So I'm curious how you might relate censorship and self-censorship, which is such a prominent discussion at the moment.
If I might add a minor point here, Eva, to your question, and this censorship or self-censorship you're talking about is sometimes directly related to the potential of funding as well, right?
All sorts of ways.
So it's really important to keep that in mind, that there are institutions, either private or different sorts of institutions you are expecting to get funded by, that really prescribe, have really specific requirements, what kind of projects they're going to fund or not. So
or to add to that, or the potential to get into the very small academy, which if you say things that you are not allowed to say, then you will ever be marginalized. So a lot of restrictions connected to this.
Yeah.
You know, I would like to say something here. I really liked, Angela, your term of the ideological inability that you wanted to discuss further. And Eva, I'm wondering, when you say that censorship, Anthi mentioned in the introduction to my work that I'm working with this question of continuities with the Nazi past inside the structures of Documenta, and I don't feel that. I mean, I really hit walls with that topic on the one hand, but on the other hand, I don't feel like anybody is censoring. But it's more probably an ideological inability to actually think and to confront your own limitations of, like, you know, you're on a track, on a trail, and it's been walked so many times already that you're practically not, you're defending basically the canon. I think what we are discussing here is also a question of, like, when we talk about centrality or periphery or marginality, what is the canon? And in my work, it's so important, and especially in this work for Documenta, it was so important to break this barrier in my audiences also, and in myself, to say, okay, but every knowledge is situated, and how do you dislocate, or how do you relocate and recenter the position from which you're thinking and speaking? It's so difficult. So I would put into question whether we're really talking about censorship in this way, or more an inability to probably leave the comfort zone. But that is my experience.
Yeah, this, in a certain sense, it is also self-censorship, probably. Thinking of who you talk to and what you might actually say. But would anyone else actually like to react to this point?
First of all, I'd like to explain how I use the term ideology and, you know, the adjective ideological or whatever. I meant it in the Althusserian sense of actually an internalized set of values that you then perform unconsciously, something which is, so I didn't mean censorship as a conscious act. When I talked about ideological inability, I think Mirla is right to say that that in the framework, in the context of dominant ideology, at least as I have seen it being operative in Greek art, by which I mean the whole complex structure of it, not artworks, right? I think that certain questions have not been raised because things have been so much there that they look as like trees, you know, something like nature, I don't know. Something which is taken for granted and is not questioned. Something needs to have a little bit of the shock of the news, such as documenta paying attention to, you know, to Athens and so on, for something to be activated. And I mean, Greece knows about censorship. We had the 20th century with dictatorships or semi-dictatorships that felt very much like this. We had a counter-revolutionary 20th century in a very strong sense. Our islands were places of exile for communists, you know, all these places where people come from wherever to holiday. So they holiday in a past of misery, torture, social isolation, and so on. And we know what is happening to some of these islands now. There have been places where actually fascism, I would say, has been activated in a different way, of course, because history does not even return as a farce. So to answer in this context briefly, Aritia Damopoulos' question about subjects, I mean, my own paper was the proposition for a subject, the subject of biopolitics as something to be addressed in art history. And I think that to come back to this, how is this to be done? I think I see it necessarily from, you know, a class perspective or a power perspective, but I just don't want to go Foucault here and talk about abstract power. I mean, as we're talking, I would say that censorship, which actually comes from a European Union directive, right, which has its own lobbies. If you, I mean, I've looked at a lot of things that have to do with the European Union and its biases and so on, no matter what it says. And I think a lot of other people have in Greece, or who work from Greece, or, you know, own Greece and so on. So we all know what this law is going to do, why it's been brought, how the liberals who dominate completely, I mean, the Greek arts in, as they do other arts, and, you know, across the globe. We know very well what this will mean, but it's not exclusive to Greece. It can't be just attended to here. We have examples from other countries where this law has been in operation and what it does. I would say, however, and that's why I talked about biopolitics, that we're past the moment of thinking in discursive terms. And this is something that art history that it has to realize, that it can no longer just be a discourse, that it has to become a material practice, much like our practices. There is no space of, you know, no safe space, unless, of course, if you come from a privileged background. So maybe for a while you don't need to care about certain things. But we're having demonstrations despite the pandemic and huge police brutality active in Athens, like just yesterday, today as well. We have helicopters kind of like flying over. It's a nightmare. The higher education system is being demolished. Police is going to be brought into the universities. There's nowhere to protect us. We have to protect ourselves, and we need to start from the ideological, but with a material conditions endpoint. So we're not at the level of discourse, I think, to just talk about censorship. That's what I meant to say.
Thank you. We have a question actually which has been waiting for quite a while, and it is a question specifically for Angela, so I'm afraid you are not going to take a breath. So
I've read the question, but maybe you want to read it out for everyone.
Yes, because I think not everyone can actually see the question that has been sent. It is sent by Alexander Strecker. And this question is for Angela. Very inspiring talk, by the way, thank you. You mentioned the need for emancipatory epistemologies. In the US context, abolition has gained ground or attention in the past year as one such approach. Decoloniality, C. Mignolo, has been a popular one in the Global South over the past decade, with roots going back decades. Can you speak more about the applicability of either of these to the Greek context? Or, if there is another emancipatory epistemology you have in mind that you think is better suited to Greece?
Yeah, I think also, my colleagues who are taking part can contribute to answering this extremely complex question that I was afraid someone would ask. Because when you bring something up that has a specific sound, epistemologist, okay, what do you have to say? And I think that since postmodernism, let's say the big decades, the 80s and so on, there were things that were introduced that were both kind of forward-looking in relation to new emancipatory subjects, but they also became, and for me at least, ultimately quite detrimental and leading to what I would call the alt-right and so on. So the way that, and I'm referring specifically to post-structuralism and the way it has operated with regards to the destabilization of truth, I beg to differ here. I don't think that all knowledges are situated. I really do not think that. And I think that I respect very much, I think it was John Haraway, who kind of introduced that term. But then this became a formulaic kind of a catchphrase, if I can put it this way. And I think it's time to question all this, because we are indeed connected more than any, in the pandemic, for instance, more than any other time, and in a very particular way that we need to articulate if we're moving on to if we are being moved on to a new phase, or what is going on exactly. So I think that we really need to depart from the certainties and in many ways the ambivalent, for me, breakthroughs that we got with the epistemology of postmodernism. I think that we need to look at how we can work with things that have currency. I know, for instance, that in feminism, intersectionality, which started from Black theory, feminist theory and so on, in relation to the working place, is something that has been widely adopted also by autonomous kind of knowledge production centers that operate in Greece. And we have fantastic work being done, for example, by the Autonomous Feminist Center, in Athens, and I could mention many others. But I think that a risk here is, and that's why I mentioned towards the end of my talk, when I mentioned the hated term national, what I meant by that is that we really need to consider, to enact a dialectic about how certain terms, such as decolonial right now, right, or intersectionality, what exactly would they mean in the material conditions of a place which is managed by a particular government and a population that is not exclusively, Greek nationals, obviously, far from it. So how is the situation managed? And if we are using terms that circulate globally, and we know very well from where these terms, emanate, what do we do with them, and how do we? I don't want to have to always adapt something. I want actual production from the context of the place, that has the refugees, that has become the dumping place of Europe in that regard, and so on. So that, yes, if this could be somehow a dialectic, leading to a synthesis at some point, that'd be great. If not, we really need to come up with epistemologies that are specific to the material conditions. I wouldn't drop anything. I feel I have my own. Anyway, I'll stop talking. I'll let other people talk, because I have a lot of things to say in answering this question I was asked.
Thank you very much. I actually have a question for Carl to change also a little bit to pick up also some other of the points that have been raised and issues that we have been thinking about. I'm wondering, you have talked about photography, and also your material is also, the material that you are working with also has to do with the Marshall Plan in Greece, and you have talked about how we can use photography and so on and so forth. I'm wondering actually, and you have also mentioned how difficult it is sometimes to, how your audience might actually be modern Greek studies, but then they don't know about images. Usually they don't see them, or they might be images, but then they don't know the context. So I'm actually wondering, what would you consider that could be also another audience for this kind of work, for photography, Marshall Plan, Greece, etc. And I'm also wondering, working with this material from the context within which you work, does it offer also other ways of thinking of the period that it refers to and also of the present? So it is two questions, basically. You can answer both or select.
I can start with the first. As I mentioned, I think that there is work being done, especially through visual anthropology, that I think is very interesting. But I also do think that also disciplines, like more traditional disciplines like history, could benefit from looking at this material. But then they would have to be able to engage with it in ways that then take into account, I don't know, the materiality of the photographs, as well as sort of this way of, as I was trying to explain, like thinking through photography, and how then photography helps us shape historical imagination about certain eras of certain national narratives, and I think that is also something that is easily. It's easier to have that interest than outside of the sort of the narrow confines of Greece. And now I forgot the second question, so you're going to have to briefly repeat that. But I do know I wanted to answer that as well.
Actually, you have already touched upon it, but you can continue. The second question was whether actually working with the material that you work, whether it offers you ways of looking at for instance, at the history of the period, or also later in other ways of looking at it than the ones that we might be mostly used to, for instance, by historians.
I can use an example from the Marshall Plan imagery, which, at face value, it is very much propaganda for specific sort of policies, in the post-war sort of liberal U.S.-led era. But I think what I found interesting in my work with looking at these images is the sort of the discontinuities between the various narratives that were being sort of pushed at that time, but also then sort of the material conditions that were actually there at that point in time, because you find, I think, both this this very melioristic, future-facing narrative is being created, but again, they're also not really there. So it is creating a certain type of fantasy, but at the same time, you do also go down to the much more on the local level, where you see where the local-led initiatives are actually maybe more interesting for this period in the Reconstruction, and also how the various local communities were able to, in many cases on their own volition, reconstruct, and that there's these contradictions that I think are useful, and that sort of specifically this collection of Marshall Plan photography can help us see, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you.
Perhaps I could take to the speakers one more question, and this is a question from Elpida Karaba. Some of you have kind of touched upon that one, but perhaps it would be nice to address it all together again. So Elpida writes, thank you very much for this very interesting roundtable. I'm very happy to see dear friends and colleagues. I have some general questions. So first, what do you think would help Greek art history to become more extrovert? And second, which subjects do you consider as important or interesting to an international audience? Yeah, perhaps some of you would like to make some more comments on that. Or are there any more reactions on that question? Two questions.
I don't have another input of that, but I think it would be very interesting to think again over what extrovert would mean in this particular moment. I don't have an answer, but I think in relation to what Angela was saying before and Neil about situated knowledge and all that, of course there are terms that we kind of adopt, and basically the critical thing is the production. But at the same time, I feel that we have to rethink or reposition ourselves regarding certain terms that they are of relevance at this particular moment. So I would diverse the question or reverse the question and say what extrovert would mean at this particular moment for Greek art history.
So are there any more reactions to these questions, perhaps from other speakers?
Just a brief comment, because I know I've talked a lot tonight. We are certainly, I mean, at least I am, having the national adjective, Greek or whatever, in front of things that may in fact lead to greater, disconnect, rather than setting bridges in place when we talk about international audiences, or I would say a public. So I'm very concerned about with this designation. And I think also I'm concerned because there are people currently here who can feel very, very excluded when this adjective comes up to describe an art scene or an art history, if you will.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to react? We have already had some reactions before, so. Okay, I would then actually like to ask another question. I was thinking, and this it is something that relates the presentation of Mil with the presentation of Angela. Mil talked actually about, in a certain ways, let's say, even though I do not like the term very much, alternative ways of doing the education for the exhibition of the Emst collection in Kassel. So a way in which had to do more with how it was experienced, or with finding different relations, not with basically telling a specific story to the audience. And Angela advocated for what could be actually a more relevant art history for Greece than the one that has been taught so far, and so on and so forth. So I'm actually wondering, it's actually a question for both. The question for me is, have you seen in your experience of doing, let's say, the education in the Emst collection, ways in which the discussions that came up, that came from the discussions that took place, would actually lead towards this kind of approaches to art history in the context of the Emst collection? Because, for example, working with the senses is one way to not talk about context sometimes. And then in reverse, for Angela, what would actually be, and okay, you're not an educator in this sense, but what could be ways of doing art education which could lead actually to a different art history that would be more relevant in Greece? And that would be actually not doing the art education for art historians, but using art to tell stories in relation to Greece. So the kind of art education that Mil was talking about, for instance. You can start the one or the other.
Well, you know, Eva, the problem that I have with this, with what we had to do, basically, what everybody had to do with his collection, who worked with his collection in Kassel. I mean, it is very effective to attach your own questions to artworks and to try to, you know, do some research, but this research would actually have to be grounded in pools of knowledge that you can tap into and that are thought provoking and that are well, you know, researched, and that was actually completely missing. I mean, it was very difficult to find information that was meaningful for us, for our situation, and within this situation to just access and tap in. So in a way, it is just doomed to be very superficial what you do, if this is not very well prepared by a very well thought through pool of information. Yeah, so it's nice to have to engage people to really think, and from the perspective of educator and from the perspective of how you can communicate maybe from the science community into a more general public. It's very interesting, I think, what Documenta did, but in terms of like real like deep thinking, no, difficult.
I don't know if I should respond now or if there are other responses to the question that was asked before.
You can
By
respond
Eva.
actually, because we don't really have much time.
Okay.
So you can respond, and feel free to also not be very long if you don't want to.
No, I don't necessarily want to be long, but I don't think that the question of art history begins in the formal art economy or institutions, which would be EMST, for instance, which would be an art history class. I think that we need, I mean, my fear at the moment with this particular direction of politics in Greece is that what's going to be offered to artists, curators, and so on is to enter an environment of intense competition, even worse than the one it is now. I see that this is what the government wants to push. It has a time issue, like it doesn't understand that these times are actually going because they have to go, but never mind that. So all the things I've seen there come from that. But as regards art history as a discipline, there is an emphasis in Greece, I think far more than I have seen elsewhere, on thinking of art history as a history of artworks. And I think this needs to be put on the sides for a while. I think we need to articulate different and parallel or intersecting histories that start from other premises, a history of institutions, a history of social struggles, and how political aesthetics or anything else, exists there, a history of independent spaces, a history of art workers, and so on. Like there's numerous things with which to start, but the important thing would be the forward looking, not in terms of progress, but because necessarily, I mean, for me, time is linear. I'm sorry, I'm not convinced by by anything else. So in this future that is not yet here and is, of course, is not written, how do we participate as a militant practice kind of located in critique and in the social field, not because the taxpayer pays, the discipline in the context of Greek universities, but because they see no other reason why the discipline should exist. It appeared at a certain moment in time, in a certain geography. Maybe it shouldn't exist if it loses certain parameters. And I think this question has been posed, of course, before, already in the 60s. So.
Can I also, just from my outside perspective, I would like to link this to the question that was asked previously in the chat. What would be an interesting thing that would be relevant to an international audience? I think that all of these questions that Angela is raising right now are kind of like linking into an almost like mythical perception of what contemporary Greece is about in terms of its function for the European Union, for like the power politics also within the EU, all this kind of like struggle to actually achieve infrastructures, to achieve the tracing of independent rooms and spaces and institutions and the building up. All of that is, I think it's very, it's something that many people have been looking at and transfixed by what Greece is doing, or people in Greece are doing, rather, probably. So I think, yes, that's something that the international audience would be very much looking forward to read, if it is please not in Greek.
Thank you.
That's another issue. Not being in Greek, it's an issue, because the other very big problem we have is that we don't have many things in Greek, so we're lacking the language, the jargon, the necessary tools, first of all, to talk amongst us about these things and then spread it around. So it's a very challenging issue, the language we're writing in.
Thank you.
But it is in precisely these terms, it is a very, very interesting issue, and it's one that is easily to be argued, I think. I don't know whether I'm clear.
Yeah, I think you are clear, and I'm also grateful to Elpida for bringing this issue up. I know she herself has actually introduced terms that I use when I write, because there is a real issue, and that's what I meant before, about the side of the production of knowledge that becomes dialectic rather than just two parallel, just a translation, for instance, right? That's, yeah.
We are at the moment that we have to make the language, because language is praxis as well. It's already, we are already taught about that. So.
Thank you. I think actually I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking that we ought to round it up and wrap it up. And in some, in many ways, I feel actually that there is way too many discussions that need to take place. And it also seems to me also that it is so, also when we talk about history, it is so much that the present is so intense. And this reminds me of the title of the previous roundtable, Our Intense Biopolitical Present, that the present is so intense in so many different ways that it is really forcing to reconsider the hows and the questions and the approaches and how we pose them and so on and so forth. So I would, is there anyone who would like to basically have a closing comment? And Anthi, would you like to add anything? I see that our time is not.
Only thing I would like to just a very brief remark. I think that like by closing this discussion, there are far more questions that have been created now than the ones we began with. And I'm not sure if that's good or bad. I guess, I mean, to me, it really works. I mean, it's a really good sign that this is a fruitful ground for more further discussion. And I would like to thank our speakers very, very much for offering their approaches tonight. Yeah.
And also thank once again Maria and Christina and Dimitris and Ambara for help us a little bit start trying to make us almost non-existent discussion so far. So thank you very much, and thank all of the people in the audience, which we hope at some point are going to be able to see live again. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.